Hello, a warm welcome also from my side to this final spotlight session of the day. It will be very hard to follow up on this great session, but Kristoffer and myself, we will do our best to do justice to this very important spot also. The next session is called Pre-empting the counter-reformation, the ethics of humanitarian reform. My own name is Andrea Steinke. I'm a research fellow at the Centre for Humanitarian Action. So. Our idea was to talk about a little bit in this session on the chances of reform systems like the Grand Bargain to, and here I quote already Kristoffer, outweigh the inequitable, undemocratic and fragile foundations of the humanitarian structure itself. Please, also to the audience, use the chat widely. We would like to encourage you to get involved in the discussion and feed into this, the questions from the chat. My colleague Ralf will bring it to the stage later on. But first of all, let me please introduce Kristoffer to you. Kristoffer Lidén is a senior researcher at the Peace Research Institute Oslo PRIO and the co-deputy director of the Norwegian Centre for Humanitarian Studies, NCHS. Holding a PhD in philosophy and an MA in Peace and Conflict Studies, his research centers on the ethics of international affairs with a focus on the fields of peace-building, humanitarian action, security politics, and digital technology. He has authored numerous articles and book chapters on the matters at hand, such as recently the protection of civilians and the ethics of humanitarian governance, beyond intervention and resilience, or another article called The Perils of Going Local, Liberal Peace-Building Agendas in Nepal. So I think he's perfectly set to talk to the matters at hand. Please, Kristoffer, kick us off with your input on the ethics of humanitarian reform.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. I've really enjoyed the discussions here and heard a lot very sensible input on humanitarian reform. And what I wanted to do in this last session, the task I got was to talk about ethics and humanitarian principles. And in that regard, I'd like to take a long step backwards and try to look at humanitarian reform from outside the humanitarian system, but from a political perspective, and think about the humanitarian principles from that perspective. Because reform is, of course, a very political issue, but that's often lost, I think, to put it probably too starkly, but in a sense, in these discussions, it seems that we envision a very chaotic world out there of political chaos, where there are these endless humanitarian problems in need of a humanitarian response. And this blinds us to the political role that the humanitarian system itself plays, and that really needs to be taken into account. Of course, that is to a large extent taken into account in the discussions that have been had here. So this is putting it very much on in the extreme, but still there is, when you look at global statistics, for instance, and look at statistics on food, sanitation, health, education, and so on, there have been dramatic improvements over the past decades in parallel with the dramatic growth of humanitarian action. And it's not only humanitarian action that is to be thanked for this development. So one should not think of the world outside the humanitarian system as void of political solutions to the humanitarian problems that the humanitarian reform is also then set up to address. So second, it is as if we don't really recognize how the humanitarian system has grown into a major political actor itself. One way of conceptualizing this, which is quite common, is to speak of humanitarian governance or humanitarian action as a mode of global governance, and a mode that has gained high prevalence over the past 3 decades. First, in the post-Cold War era, with its coherence with a kind of liberal world order and global liberal governance. It fitted very well into that setting, also as a part of peace building, for instance, that represented a major new venue for humanitarian action. But also with the waning of liberal peace building, of liberal governance, humanitarian action still maintains a key kind of driver in global governance because of its apolitical or politically neutral image. So this, one then needs to think about what sort of political entity this is. And I think that, for instance, in her introduction to the opening dialogue, Samruti Patel said something really important. She said that if we don't recognize the dimension of power in these discussions and how power really is a key part of the dynamics that humanitarian reform need to take into account, it doesn't do the trick. So focusing on funding, for instance, focusing on limited transfers of representation as part of the localization agenda and so on. If it doesn't really address the dimension of power, it doesn't do the trick. And I'm thinking of this as a very fundamental issue that one needs to think about the power that is actually exercised by the by the humanitarian system. Because when we talk about humanitarian reform, it's easy to think about the political world out there as being unaffected by successful humanitarian governance. But actually humanitarian governance makes a huge political difference. It has political effects on the ground. So as Andrea mentioned, there are these fundamental problems with this mode of governance that are highlighted by the debates on decolonizing aid and also in the background of the localization agenda. Problems of inequality or inequity in terms of the distribution of resources, who possess the resources. Localization is supposed to be a response to that. It's a partial response, but then one also needs to think about how humanitarian governance is embedded in a broader system of global governance, in a broader global political order that is also so fundamentally unequal that a slightly more localized humanitarian system does not really do the trick. Then secondly, it's undemocratic in a fundamental sense. Even if you get more participation from local counterparts, from recipients or beneficiaries in the humanitarian system, there's the whole system is not democratically accountable in any kind of sense that deserves to be called democratic. And this is a problem that makes a successful humanitarian system facing this, as we will return to, this democratic deficit. The more powerful it gets, the more successful it gets, the larger the democratic problem becomes, in a sense. And thirdly, it's unsustainable. It doesn't possess the sort of power that states possess. It doesn't possess the sort of power that military actors possess. It means that if you build a wonderful humanitarian castle, it's still a castle of sand, as long as it's not properly anchored in genuine politics. And this brings up the question of what are the alternatives, or how can this be taken into account when we think about humanitarian reform? And here, there have been arguments strong arguments also lately for really recognizing the political role of humanitarian action and therefore also putting this political neutrality to the side and making humanitarian action or humanitarian governance explicitly political, making it a source of justice, a source of global justice. This is, of course, a good old debate between Denantist and Wilsonian, or kind of rescue-based and other more activist forms of humanitarian action. But it's also something that is present in this question of humanitarian reform, where strong voices call for a politicizing humanitarian governance, given the role that it has. And here, my very sort of conservative position is that actually the whole point with humanitarian action is the political neutrality. That's the rationale of humanitarian action. So instead of taking this political neutrality away, the solution for humanitarian reform must be to retain the political neutrality of humanitarian action and making space for international political engagement in finding sustainable, democratic, and equitable responses to the world's humanitarian problems outside of the humanitarian system. Okay, so that's my introductory.
Yes, very, very interesting thoughts, and I think there are many things that circulate probably already in the chat surrounding those notions. I'm going to cite one of the speakers yesterday. I think she said humanitarians are supposed to find solutions also to problems. So let's maybe try also. Both of us, we work in think tanks, but still our role should also be to look a little bit more into the direction of solutions. So what, in your view of what you just said, what would be a viable way forward toward a different kind of reform that is different than what we have heard today and yesterday on the state of the art of the grand bargain, possibly also taking into account what you have called the democratic legitimacy? And if I may put another question there, with regard to political neutrality and the humanitarian principles, there is also this call for the decolonization also of the humanitarian principles that would include the principle of neutrality as well. What is your take on those positions?
So, one thing, let's focus then on the humanitarian principles first, because I wanted to speak to kind of the principled basis of humanitarian reform. And a lot of what has been said about localization, about transfer of power to local counterparts, of flexible funding, all of this, I think still would be in line with my argument. It's just that that's not really a solution to the political problems that it's set out to address. So it's not a sufficient solution to these issues. And also I'm inspired by this initial humanitarian development nexus, now the triple nexus that was part of the grand bargain and has been kind of integrated as a key part of that, which is problematic with regards to the humanitarian principles, because while the idea is that the humanitarian principles are retained in that nexus, still the integration with these other dimensions, development and security, presents humanitarian principles with a problem. How do you interpret that? How do you deal with neutrality in that setup? This is something that you, Andrea, has also written very well on in terms of Mali, for instance, and I'd like to hear maybe from you in terms of that case, of whether you can see sort of the relevance or the connection to what I'm saying. But the principles, the humanitarian principles that we operate with today, are not, they're not objective. They're not the objective definition of humanitarian action. They were kind of constructed after the Second World War in their current formulation. They draw on Dunant and his kind of writings, but it's not like these principles are holy. And therefore also the current formulations of neutrality, impartiality, independence, they are formulations that sort of respond to the international political setting that they were defined within. This means that I think there should be a flexibility to these principles, but the neutrality component, I would say, precedes the humanitarian principles and Dunant and everything. The idea that you can have an actor in a situation where people don't get their needs fulfilled in any other way, that enters to assist without having kind of a political agenda, but the agenda of assisting these people based on pure altruism. This is not a kind of Western intervention. This is something that you find in different versions in all world religions. It's something that you find across the political spectrum. So while I'm very much in favor of redefining the humanitarian principles, I think it should be about making them as universal as possible and retaining the neutrality of humanitarian action. But in this connection, it's really important to emphasize that it's a misunderstanding that political neutrality means that you cannot take a political stance or be concerned by the political effects of humanitarian action. Now, when humanitarian governance has developed into a veritable political force in many parts of the world, it is completely necessary to take the political effects into account. And for instance, the current debate on the principle of neutrality has been provoked partly by developments in Myanmar, now in Tigray, where you have a humanitarian presence, and this presence sort of reinforces political actors that one sees as really part of the problem. So in that situation, one really has the question, are the effects of the action so important that we do not want to withdraw in this situation? It confronts humanitarian actors with a classic humanitarian dilemma of complicity and of compromise. And this is nothing new, but so I think it's crucial that humanitarian actors take a political stance on whether they want to operate in situations where they might be complicit to harm. But one therefore needs to distinguish between neutrality as a principle for how one intervenes, a sort of procedural concern, and the political consequences that presence has. So in that respect, I think that humanitarian action needs to be more political in thinking about the political effects, but defining the space for humanitarian action in terms of how it operates by the principle of neutrality.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for your patience.
Yeah, sure. We started a little bit late, so it's all fine here. Before I invite Ralf to the stage, I just want to say a couple of things, as you also mentioned our research on the Triple Nexus and on Mali. First of all, I want to thank you for clarifying what you mean by neutrality and political neutrality, because I think like with all the humanitarian principles, it is often seen as an absolute and overall universalistic categories where we should maybe also differentiate between different kinds of neutrality in this way. And as Marc Dubois in one of our papers has written a little bit in contrast to what to your point is that he puts humanity as a preceding principle that kind of should guide all humanitarian actors in their interventions. And as you have pointed out to our research in Mali, of course, definitely for me as an anthropologist, I can say that you should always regard context. There's always context, and there's not one universalistic context that ascribes a certain form of dealing and intervention. And especially, I would say, in Mali, you have to watch out for the different constellations of power. You have mentioned power as one of the main characteristics, and I think especially in this case regarding the triple nexus, because you asked, you kind of referred the ball to me. Especially in this context, we have to really analyze the constellations of power before we come up with decisions towards the ways of intervention, and also entangling different forms of assistance and intervention. With that, I would like to invite Ralf. I hope, and I'm sure that the discussion in the chat is very lively. So,
it is indeed. Hi, Kristoffer. Many thanks for being with us. You inspired indeed two debates, actually, in the chat, as you might have cited. One is a bit on your notion, do we really should look at the humanitarian sector as something autonomous, independent, or don't we need a broader view to understand also its own context? And Markus Geiser of ICRC, the Germany team, raised the question if we should rather talk about an arena, something more interdependent, and was second also by Shruti Patel, who said, well, the system is, by anyway, a term coming from a pretty colonization age and should be probably overcome. Maybe you would be happy to comment on that. And the second string of discussion has been on the notion of neutrality, starting with a controversy as we sometimes hear it, and elaborated here interestingly. Ulrike von Pilar, former MSF director in Germany, questioned if the concept of neutrality doesn't need to be looked at in a very differentiated way, as international actors might sometimes have a more neutral approach than local ones, provoking opposing comments if that's not looking in a sufficiently complex way of things. Here Geneva replied that we might need to have a different approach on neutrality in future, and some others seconded on what Hugo Slim has contributed to the debate. So I'm sure you are very happy to comment on these points, and with that I'll leave it to you and Andrea to conclude.
Thank you, Ralf. So, Kristoffer, the stage is yours. I know it's those are very hard questions, but I'm sure.
Those are all excellent questions. In terms of arena, I fully agree that that's a better way of thinking about the actual politics of humanitarian action. When we talk about humanitarian reform and when I see how the world is portrayed and how humanitarian action is portrayed, part of the problem is this idea of a concerted humanitarian system. So I fully agree that thinking of it as an arena of negotiation in what David Kennedy has called the world of struggles is more helpful. And we see a lot of contestation within the humanitarian system, in inverted commas. And we also, it's really crucial to recognize that humanitarian action is the result of multiple actors maintaining different interests, and it's not like they're rallying around a shared understanding of humanitarian problem that they are there to address. So that's a problem for ideas of humanitarian reform if the underlying assumption is that there is a shared understanding of what the problems are that we need to come together to resolve. And the history of peace building showed how the localization agenda led to the building of a sort of artificial NGO society that became a political force in these countries. I saw a comment in the chat on that. It's that of course local actors can also be neutral, and that this idea of neutrality doesn't exclude that local actors are, you know, a part of the humanitarian enterprise. And I fully agree with that. But on the other hand, one should realize that, you know, this politics are interest-driven, and humanitarian action is a continuation of both global and local political struggles. That's a better way of kind of thinking about this arena than as an arena of common solutions to shared problems.
Thank you very much, Kristoffer. With that, I will close this spotlight session for today. Thank you so much for all the insights. I think we have a lot of things to take with us to maybe think a little bit more about in the upcoming days. And I would really appreciate for us to keep in discussion. And also, as you might know, there is a Slack channel where all the participants at this conference, and you know, you can invite all your colleagues and friends and family to participate in there as well, to kind of create a space where this conference is also meaningful beyond this representation mode that it so often ends up with. So thank you very much, Kristoffer. I'm looking forward to more collaboration with you, and I think also all the three spotlight sessions have complemented each other in a nice way. And I also want to applaud you for your very special and sophisticated background pictures. We have talked about it for everyone else. Kristoffer is in this picture twice. So this has kind of, yeah, it had made my day before. Yes, there's someone in the back of this picture. And yeah, it's also important to be a little bit easy with things sometimes. So thank you so much. Thank you to all the participants in the chat, and thank you for all the nice and pressing questions. I will now invite my colleague Darina, who has done the lion's share of this work on the conference, to wrap it up. And yeah, thank you so much, and see you soon, hopefully.
Thank you.
Hello, also again from my side. Today I had the pleasure to be on the listening side and the audience side for most of the time. But now I wanted to share a little wrap-up with you before I will leave you all and we close our conference. We had in total 6 sessions, 3 of them being panels and 3 of them being spotlights. The panels have been accompanied by a graphics designer, Nicolene Louw, who has been tuning in from South Africa. And I thought we could take her graphics as a little bit of a guidance for wrapping up. So let us start with the first graphics that we can share here from the first panel. Where we've discussed the more general insights on the Grand Bargain as a reform process as such. And as you can see on the upper left side, there is a nicely painted, frustrated little man representing Klaus Sørensen, the former DJ Echo, who has shared his pain and frustration throughout the reform process. And I think that's also familiar to many others who have been engaged in this process for the last 5 years. Well, it's painful to do changes and to reform, But I think we have also made at least some progress, and that has also been coming out of this session very prominently. We heard that the main challenge is still in trying to make more local voices not only heard and acknowledged, but also to integrate them in the global policy level debate and the reform process as such. And we heard that this is not only a lack of money, the hindrances to do so, but also it has been before the Grand Bargain a lack of tangible commitments. And what we saw is that at least in this regard, the Grand Bargain could contribute a little bit to these, to make commitments more tangible. And we found that now that commitments are tangible, it is now time to put them into practice beyond piloting the sum of the reforms. We also found that attitudes and behaviors need to change a little bit more. And this is nicely illustrated at the upper right-hand side of the second graphic that we can see here now. Attitudes and behaviors of single individuals, single staff have, of course, also a lot of influence in the reform process. That's all for the first panel. Let's turn to the second panel. We've been talking about more of the quality of the relationships between locals and internationals, and the intermediaries between them. And we found that the main hindrances for a more equal eye-to-eye level partnership is maybe not so much trust anymore, but the still prevailing competition for funding that many intermediaries that are at the same time INGOs present on the ground are facing. So this is one of the main hindrances to give away power and to give and free up space for more local, more national partners. Last but not least, there's also a lot of hope. Can we go back to the second panel again? Because there is also some hope that's put in the quote. It's not all bad. That's the little man saying right in the middle, I would say. And so there is some bright horizon coming up, and there is some good examples. And especially those international organizations that have had a working tradition with local and national partners are actually really driving the change and the development here. Now let's go to the third panel on quality funding, where we were joined by Ambassador Sibylle Zorc in the beginning, who has admitted, of course, that there is still a long way to go, also for Germany as a donor. However, she said there is small steps, there is little progress, and that's nicely illustrated by this little worm having little wings, but still not being a butterfly. And I think that's pretty much captures the stage where we are right now. And Sorcha O'Callaghan also joined this discussion, and she recognized the engagement that has been made from Germany, especially with regards to anticipatory funding. But of course, there's also more to do. There is some political momentum, but we need to move beyond piloting studies and piloting practices, and that's actually also putting other comments from the earlier panels up again. Finally, we have had the Start Fund from Bangladesh as an example, where Saeed shared some of his insights on how a progress on funding could be successful, and it's also nicely summarized on this graphic here on the right side. It's, I think, a 1, 2, 3, 5 points, nice summary. We need funding that. 5 points, everybody could read this themselves. Nicely summary, I guess. Finally, we have had the 3 spotlights. Unfortunately, we do not have slides for these to share. However, I will share some of my key takeaways, which are from the gender spotlight, that the Grand Bargain has been indeed gender blind in the beginning, and it still is, not only because of its gender blind indicators, but also its gender blind structures, and the consultations and participation was really gender blind. But there is also here some progress which has been made, especially in the localization workstream and the cash workstream, which have formulated concrete guidance notes, best practices, and instruments that we could use. However, gender is a topic which not only is prominent in the humanitarian sector, but also in many local contexts. And of course, this also interferes with each other. The second spotlight on innovation, in this spotlight we had Sonia talking to Ben Ramalingam, and he said that, well, there is a lot of innovation happening under the radar, and there's a lot of innovation that has happened despite of the humanitarian system and not because of it, and of course that needs to change. But there have been some factors that were pressing innovation and also giving opportunities for new innovation. And this is what we exactly have to nurture. Last but not least, Andrea talked to Kristoffer Lidén, and they'd had a conversation on ethics and the underlying assumptions of the humanitarian reform system. They talked a lot about neutrality and how it can be defined and redefined in a democratic way, reforming the humanitarian way of doing things so far. And this also linked back to the link of the humanitarian system to its political and wider social world. So that's my brief run through all the lessons that I at least have taken from the conference so far. I am sure I will find many more by the time the video recording is available. However, we will close here now, and I will not do this without some acknowledgement. And I have to take a sip of water because I have many people to thank. First of all, of course, we want to thank the panelists who have actually contributed the most part of this conference. Thank you for sharing your views, your opinions, and your experiences with us. We are truly thankful for this opportunity and for all the learnings we will take from these. We've had experts from different levels, global level, so the local level, the global north and the global south, from women and men, and from practice and think tanks. Thank you to all these diverse contributors. Another big thank you to the online audience. Of course, also your comments and questions have contributed to this lively discussion. And we are very happy that you shared all your inputs in the chat. Furthermore, you can, another nice advertisement for our Slack channel, you can network and link on the Slack channel. Even now when the conference is closed, you can do the networking there as you would do in an in-person conference. So please make wide use of this. You can exchange and chat a little bit among your peers. Finally, let me also thank Nicolene, who has contributed these great graphics that are so fabulous. They will surely end up in some or the other way very prominently in our office. I'm very sure of that. Another great thank you to the team of Live Records who have really who stuck with us the last 2 days and managed several troubleshootings and technical issues with us. Thank you for your expertise and your support. And finally, I want to thank Oxfam for giving us this space for holding the conference. Of course, this is also a very relevant contribution. Last but not least, I want to thank the CHA team, especially those behind the cameras that you have not seen so far, because without their contributions, all of us here in front of the camera would not be as productive as we were. So a special thanks especially to Arvid, Lena and Kilian, who have managed the technical support and the communication, not only in the chat, but also on Twitter, on Slack, and so on. Yeah, that's all I can say from my side, and I hope you bear with us also after the conference. Please, if you have not done so, please, you can register for our newsletter. You can follow us on Twitter, of course, and on other social media channels as LinkedIn. And having said that, I'm happy to welcome you for our next upcoming events. Please stay tuned, and with that I say goodbye and thank you for your words and for your contributions.